Hello and welcome to this lecture on extension arguments. I'm Elliot Jones. I'm going to be chatting you through how to make extension arguments, how to make good extension arguments that judges don't dismiss. This is another lecture in our lecture series which are made for our new debaters who are coming in, who may have missed a lecture in person at a training and are wishing to fill that gap, or maybe have joined later in the semester and are just looking to kind of catch up on a few things. Are these lectures perfect and all-encompassing of debate? Of course not, because there's lots of complexity and layers. But for new debaters, we think that this lecture will be really, really good at helping you improve your extension arguments if you're coming to them for the very first time. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into the lecture. Great. Let's chat about where this fits in the debate, because generally what I've been asking you to think about is things that are predominantly an opening half mindset. I've been telling you to kind of forget about closing half for the meantime. Let's just think about this kind of opening bench, this OG and this OO. So now I'm going to ask you to specifically turn and think about your closing half. Lots of these things still apply. So what makes a good substantive still applies here. What makes good rebuttal still applies here. But there are some things that you have to do uniquely differently in closing half to separate your case. One of the key things you have to do is you need to provide what is called new analysis that contributes to the debate. What does that mean? Well, it pretty much means, really simply, you've got to make arguments that are different and contribute new material that helps you win the debate from your opening half. So if I'm an OG and I run a case on something, then the closing government in the dark green beneath us, they have to run new arguments, new analysis. And if they don't, what they're going to be called is derivative, which pretty much in debate sense means that that analysis is generally not credited because it is the same analysis that has already been won and it's not actually adding anything to the debate. Okay, so how do you do this? So we call these new types of analysis extensions because you're extending off what has already been made in the debate. This is a new kind of extension of the arguments that have already happened in the front half. So there's kind of two key types of extensions that I like to think about when I'm making these arguments. The first way to go about it is to outframe and recharacterize, which is pretty much to say, hey, here's some brand new lines of argumentation, and here's why they are more important than kind of what's been going on broadly in the first half. I'm going to chat about that in more depth in a moment, but I just wanted to flag kind of briefly what that was. The second one is missing critical analysis. I think this is a lot harder to do. I think you're much more likely to be called derivative if you do this, so I'd be very careful doing this. But I think it's very important that you understand how to do this. So what this looks like is pretty much, hey, the opening bench has gone and made their argument, but it's missing this key step, which means that it doesn't function. What we're going to do is come in and fill that key step, and because of that, because it didn't work before we stood up and it now works after we've stood up, you should kind of credit us with that analysis. I'm going to chat you through how to do both of these over the next few slides. Okay, so what does a good outframe or recharacterization look like in the debate? I also like to call this extending outwards because you're going and saying, here's the arguments in the top half, and we're going to go out beyond that and do some new things. I often think this is easier. This is what I recommend my novs to do if they can come up with this. I think this is the preferable approach. Totally understand if you can't. That's why we'll chat about the other approaches in a moment, but always prioritize this one. That's why I'm sharing it with you first. So pretty much you should give an example of kind of new, kind of fresh analysis that is different from your opening bench. What does that look like? I imagine you're asking. So what that looks like, here's an example of it, is I was in a debate a while ago and there was a discussion about how kind of weaponized robotics, like dogs, like personnel, think like the Tesla robot, but you give it a gun, right? Or you give it pepper spray or a taser, right? And there was an argument about whether this was going to be a net good or net bad for society. And so the opening bench talked a ton about how this was going to be applied in a military context, how armies were going to use it, how that was going to be really bad. And then when we came up on closing, what we talked about was, hey, we buy this analysis that it's bad and we agree with our opening bench. But we think the thing you should care more about is how this is applied in kind of a police setting. Like, how does this be applied with like police jobs and police personnel being replaced by these things? Because we think this is like the more important part of the debate. What are the risks when you kind of approach this kind of new argument that's very, very different from what's been discussed in opening? Well, the problem is that you're likely to be called dismissive. You're likely to have judges say that you're missing the clash points that have already gone on in opening bench, right? So how do you fix that? How do you avoid your judge saying that to you? Well, I give you kind of two key core fixes for this. Firstly, when you do this, I would encourage you to take out an entire minute at the start of your speech and say, here's a really clear reframe of why this is either A, way more likely to be the way the world looks than what happened in opening half. So if you're kind of flipping and saying, we don't actually think that's how it pans out, we think this is a much more likely scenario, then you need to explain that. The second thing is you need to explain why it's way more impactful, right? So how is it impacting a lot more people in this debate? For example, the police one was like, hey, your police interact with people on an every single day basis. They interact with lots of them. And in militaries, the truth is that they don't actually get used very often. Countries don't go to war very often because of nuclear deterrence and things like this, right? So because of that, you need to explain why the material you're bringing up is kind of the likely world the debate is to occur in, if it is different. And then why is this the most important stuff the judge should be caring about in the debate? So that means that you're unlikely to be told that you're like dismissive or irrelevant in the debate. The second fix I would give you is to still engage, to still provide rebuttal. What does that look like? I'm going to chat it through to you in a later slide, but it just means if you're in closing government, don't just ignore what your OO has said and just say, hey, our material is way more important, because the judge may not buy that. So you still want to have some really good engagement with them. So it feels like to the judge that you're being very charitable and still engaging with your top half of the debate. You're saying, hey, here's why they're wrong in OO if we're in CG, and vice versa if you're in closing opposition. Okay. The second key thing you can do is say, if you don't have brand new arguments, which is totally fine, you can say there's kind of missing critical analysis. But the question is, how do you do that well? So I like to call this extending inwards on your case. So pretty much like, hey, here's the analysis I'm going to give you, but it's going to fill a gap that's already been made by my opening bench. I chatted about this a little bit earlier, but just to remind you, what we're thinking about here is when your opening half does something that is a good argument, you think, but they maybe miss out on core mechanization, or they miss a key step in their kind of framing that was kind of vital to understand it. If you can go back and fill in those kind of assumptions or assertions that they've made, and at the start of your speech the point doesn't work, and at the end of your speech the point does work, you should be able to take credit for this point, at least to some degree. The risks are that you just mispick this or misunderstand it. I think this happens a lot more for new debaters, but it happens to me all the way through to this day. I think it happens to really good debaters, that they just are like, oh, I think there's this core piece of missing analysis, and the judge is like, I didn't, which just happens because debaters have different perceptions of how a debate should be seen and judged. So there's kind of two key things I would flag to kind of make sure that you don't get this from a judge irrationally, because I think particularly, I don't think this happens on very good circuits, but occasionally particularly lazy judges can hear this analysis and wish to flag it as kind of derivative of your opening half, even when it isn't. So two fixes I give you. Firstly, I would encourage you to clearly flag the gap for the judge, because I think this is one of the biggest problems. They say, hey, we're fixing this, and the judge is like, I don't think there was a gap there. So clearly flag what the gap is. You say, hey, they're making this analysis, and they go this, they're missing this, which is core for their analysis, and we're going to fill that, right? So flag really clearly, explain to the judge why their point doesn't functionally work without that. And make sure you do it really well. I would spend extra time on this if you're in doubt, and make sure you're crystal clear to the judge. And then when you go to fill it, obviously do a very good job. Do all the good things that I encourage you to do when you're filling the gaps. So if it's mechanisms, make sure your mechanisms are very clear. They're very deep. All the good things that we talk about in a substantive. My second fix is a terrible fix, in my opinion, and it's going to sound a little bit shitty. But the truth is, just like, make sure that you get it right. My encouragement is, if you're in doubt and you're like, I don't actually think the opposition missed this, like, don't touch it. Just leave it in peace, because I think more often than not, if you are on the edge, you're probably like have the right instinct and it probably isn't a gap that needs filled. Only if you're like, hey, I think this is a blatant, very big gap, would I go in and fill it. Okay. So how do you engage? Because I chatted a little bit about making sure that you do engage, particularly as a member, because obviously whips are a little bit different, and we'll probably chat about what that looks like. But particularly for members, I think people struggle with how much engagement should I actually provide in a debate, and how should I engage? Because obviously I need to provide my new analysis, but how much do I weight that, given there's been a bunch of opening speeches above me that I need to respond to? So my first advice would be, just don't deal with the little things. Don't be nitpicky. Don't go after tiny arguments. Pick kind of the core argument of your diagonal's case. So if you're in closing government, that's your opening opposition. They're diagonal to you. And if you're in closing opposition, your diagonal will be your opening government. So pick kind of their biggest argument and just take it head on. Is it okay if you can't take it out fully? Yes, because your whip speaker can continue to do more work and finish taking it out. But leaving your whip speaker burdened without having to take out major arguments that you haven't begun to start responding to is really, really difficult, right? For them to integrate properly into their speech and get away with. So that's my advice. My other piece of advice is kind of be a little bit charitable, right? I think teams often are like trying to be quite dismissive. They're like, hey, I don't like buy this analysis, rah, because they're trying to prop their extension. And my advice is be a little bit more charitable. Just say, hey, I'm going to take them at their best. And in theory, I think this is the best argument of theirs is. Because you don't actually get a lot of time to respond to them. And I think often opening halves can get locked in this deadlock where they're both super uncharitable, not very good at engaging with each other. So if you can be kind of nice and be like, hey, here's what we think their argument is at its best, and here's how we beat them anyway, I think that's a really, really good place to be in. Finally, my advice is multi-layered analysis. Take depth over breadth. I've kind of already talked about this, about picking their biggest argument. I don't want like a bunch of one-line responses to like every single argument they gave. That'll just be a waste of your time that actually doesn't do much in the debate. My advice would be pick one, maybe two big arguments and just say, here's like 3 layers of response to this, right? Go watch the rebuttal lecture that I've given, which will talk you through how do you actually get those layers, how do you actually get that depth of analysis, and that should hopefully help you with putting that together. I think that's broadly my advice here for engagement. So make sure to engage, but don't spend too much time engaging. So it's about striking that balance, but you'll get a better feel for that over time. My bonus tip, though, is prioritize your extensions, especially if you're a member, and even if you're kind of a whip. My advice is, there's a lot of content that's gone on in the debate. So as a member, my advice is make sure that you're really cognizant that you're not spending too much time on rebuttal. I would sacrifice your time on rebuttal to make a very, very good extension, because if you don't have good extension, it actually doesn't matter, right? Because you need that positive extension material to win the debate. It doesn't actually matter how good your rebuttal is, doesn't matter how good your analysis is. If you just like have no extension that isn't good in the debate, you can't go on to win it. And then even in whip speakers, I give the same advice, just slightly different, and I'll caveat this a little bit, which is just, obviously you wish to engage with every other team because that's your job as the whip speaker, and see how it kind of pans out in the debate. But the frame of reference I would hold for this is kind of moving from your extension out to them, being like, hey, here's what their arguments were, here's why they're wrong, and here's why our extension's beating this. Like, always be coming back to that extension of yours, because that is the core way you're going to go about winning the debate and closing. I see so many teams under prioritize their extension, especially at a novice level. So that's my advice for you there. Finally, what should you do in prep time? Because lots of debaters are like, well, I don't actually know what to prep. So my advice is kind of, your prep time should be used to kind of forecast what the debate is that you think is going to happen. So kind of think up the core most likely arguments you're going to see in the government side, the most core likely arguments you're going to see in the opposition side, and be like, okay, where is the debate going to clash? Because if there's going to be a deadlock, I'm going to come up with some creative ideas of how I'm going to break that. And then if there's a deadlock, even if there's not a deadlock occurring, like there's kind of these two core arguments, what's the kind of the third kind of new fresh argument I'm going to bring in that's a little bit different, right? Will you get it right every time? No. But as you see lots and lots of debates, you'll get very, very good at forecasting and kind of knowing what kind of arguments are going to come out. So I've spent a lot of time debating. So I have a reasonably good idea of what arguments I'm likely to see in the debate, and that'll really help you when you get into the room and you kind of are seeing the debate unfold at least slightly how you thought it was going to be. Finally, thank you so much for watching. Please follow us on Instagram if you're not already, because then you can find out when our training times are. I would shout out when our training times are currently, but my problem is that it may change semester to semester. I also promise you a bit of funny content on there because my head of Instagram is significantly more funny than I am, and it'll be a lot more interesting these in lectures. So thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you at our actual trainings very soon. But all the very best with your debating. And thank you.